Good afternoon, everybody, right from New York. With you today, uh, my name is Irina Tsukerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today with us, we have Kyle Shideler. We are going to be discussing the issue of Middle Eastern peace processes and foreign influence campaigns in the United States. This is part of the Washington Outsider's domestic security series. On the one hand, peace building processes provide endless opportunities to build common ground, to improve relations, to engage in improve the business opportunities for all involved. On the other hand, they're not always what they appear to be, and behind the scenes, they sometimes increase rather than decrease the threat of foreign influence campaigns. That's not always positive. Specifically in the U.S., there's been a great over the past 4 years since the outbreak of the Gulf crisis. There's been a lot of back and forth between different parties after the conclusion of the Arula Agreement. The lobbying efforts and the media efforts and the influence campaigns, both economic and political, did not cease. They actually, if anything, increased and took on slightly different forms, focusing actually more on Western media and Western lobbies, and less on domestic Middle Eastern media. We have also seen that following the conclusion of Abraham Accords between Israel and several Muslim states, on the one hand, there was, as I mentioned, proliferation of positive outreach between all of these countries involved. On the other hand, you have seen some of the countries that have not been part of the agreement increase political activity in the U.S. that seems to be at least partially aimed at undermining some of the actors in these agreements and that have taken a decidedly negative outlook on these issues. All of this is a little bit concerning, not because foreign countries shouldn't have a say or be able to represent their interests when presenting themselves to the U.S. public, to the U.S. government, but because of the form that it has taken. And there's been a growing concern from people like Kyle and Dave Reboy and a number of others over recent years about the sheer amount of investments into these lobbying efforts, about sometimes undetectable form of influence that can fool a lot of people, and the fact that some of it is divisive, polarizing, aggressive, and presents frankly security issues. This is what we're going to talk about today. Kyle, if you could give us a brief overview of some of the most significant issues concerning this before we get into more specific examples. I have a couple of recent stories in mind.
Sure. Well, I think we have to start off by keeping in mind that the United States is a very large, multi-ethnic republic. It has always been the case in the United States that citizens who maybe have some attraction or connection to their homeland, wherever they find their roots, have lobbied in defense of or in support of those countries. I mean, we saw this whether it was between the conflict between Britain and the IRA in Northern Ireland. Obviously, you know, the Jewish Americans in the United States, very strong supporters of Israel for the most part. You see this really with any small ethnic group in the United States, and it's normal and it's to be understood. It's acceptable. It's a thing that happens in any republic. What I think became more concerning over the years, especially after the end of the Cold War, while the United States was increasingly becoming a monopower, a unipower in the globe, it became increasingly clear to countries that they could only solve their foreign policy issues and concerns in Washington, D.C. That was the place to get an answer. And as the U.S. became more robust and aggressive in foreign policy after 9/11, where we were, going in and changing regimes that had confronted us or that we had issues with in the past. It became even more important and more relevant for all manner of foreign actors to try to influence the U.S. government. And this was accelerated because the US government was also looking for ways to influence the Middle East. So they were reaching out to groups and people and trying to find people who would become useful assets for them in the region. And at the same time, they thought they were influencing the region, they were also being influenced. And I think that's important to understand as well. So I'm thinking particularly about the role of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is obviously an international network which has a strong Western component and even a United States component. And they have a network inside the United States where they lobby on behalf of their various interests. And the US government latched onto a lot of these lobbies in order to effect change across the globe. And this was especially true during the Arab Spring, where you had the US government working together with Syrian rebel lobbies and Libyan rebel lobbies through the networks of the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's part of the issue. At the same time, who was funding certain universities and at high levels. And what became interesting was during this period of the Arab Spring, as the various regimes in the region abandoned the Muslim Brotherhood because they saw that the Brotherhood was trying to displace them, they lost a lot of their networks inside the United States because they had been based, either knowingly or unknowingly, on individuals who had Islamist sympathies. So I'm thinking of the influence, for example, that Saudi Arabia used to influence at the Georgetown University, but which was largely lost because the individuals that they relied upon for that, guys like John Esposito, were more Islamist than anything else. They were pro-Islamist. And so when Saudi Arabia turned anti-Islamist as a genuine policy, they lost a lot of their influence in the United States, and that influence was picked up by Qatar and it was picked up by Turkey. So when you went into the conflict over Qatar's behavior in the Arab Spring with the boycott and so on, a lot of these countries had lost influence that they had relied upon before, and Qatar had gained it. So they were really at a disadvantage as that whole issue was being debated and decided. And we saw how that played out because President Trump came out initially with some very strong statements critical of Qatar and its behavior in the region, including things like backing jihadist elements in Syria and Libya. And that very quickly got walked back, and it was no longer discussed. And I think part of the reason is because there was not an equivalent lobby on the other side to make an argument.
We have seen that some of these lobbying efforts take a turn for the downright criminal in terms of leaks, leaked emails, hacks, and so forth. One rather complicated issue that I wanted to delve into a little bit before we go into more contemporary episodes was the story with Elliot Brody. Now, what makes it so interesting is two things. On the one hand, Elliot Brody is suing the state of Qatar for leaking and for hacking his emails and messages and illegally leaking and disseminating this information. And that story had an involvement with many different actors, former intelligence officers from the US and UK. I'll love just Moroccan Qatari agent who was recruiting people in the Jewish community and conservative community, people perceived to be close to President Trump, for Qatar to be engaged. And he was behind this supposed hacking dissemination effort. There were hacks of other figures going on at the same time besides Brody, linked specifically to the Emirates, such as Ambassador Otaiba and a whole host of critics from around the world who were critical of Qatar and who were on hacking lists, or who were actually hacked. So on the one hand, Brody was apparently a victim of an illegal cybercrime for which he has unsuccessfully tried to pursue a legal case, and now it's entering a new stage. He refiled the case with the new evidence, other witnesses, and so forth. It's unclear where it's going, but it's still in litigation, hasn't been completely dismissed. On the other hand, Brody himself had been under criminal investigation for alleged unregistered lobbying on behalf of the UAE, in part on the basis of WhatsApp messages between him and another former Emirati operative, George Nader, who himself was convicted of unrelated charges. But they exchanged discussions supposedly claiming credit for influencing Trump's decision to fire Rex Tillerson, who was perceived to be a pro-Qatar influence in U.S. foreign policy. So we see that Elliot Brody himself was charged with a crime that up until that point, FARA was not really being enforced as a criminal matter. It was at best a charge that forced people to register retroactively, but Brody may have been one of the first cases where someone is actually facing criminal charges specifically for that. On the other hand, none of the Qatar-related individuals in his lawsuit or outside of it had been charged for similar violations. And I am finding it rather curious as to why was Brody charged for that when up until that point, many people were forced to register under FARA retroactively, especially in light of these Gulf crisis related campaigns, but nobody was actually under criminal investigation. What made Brody's case different? Was it simply because he was perceived to be a Republican Trump supporter? Was it the case that he was pro-Emirati, and was he being treated differently than pro-Qatar lobbyists? What's your take on this situation?
Sure. So, I mean, the Foreign Agent Registration Act goes way back in the United States, and you're quite right in saying that for a long time it had been largely defunct. It doesn't have a large office to enforce it. It's not a very sexy issue if you're an FBI agent trying to make your name. And so for a long time, it's been sort of ignored. And either openly or yeah, as you said, they'll sort of retroactively say, well, you probably should register. Occasionally, it will be used in an actual espionage situation where, there's clear evidence that you have a counterintelligence problem. And I'm thinking about something like, like of the Anna Chapman level of, of the Russian agent, where you have a clear espionage ring, you have obvious, but you're not going to charge them with espionage. So you're going to charge them with FARA, roll them up and kick them out of the country or something like that. So we've seen it used like that. But to use it against a American citizen and a relatively high profile American citizen, closely allied with or linked to the governing party and the president at the time, was, I think, somewhat unprecedented. And it is the concerning part of the whole incident is, as you said, there was a lot of evidence that any number of people were engaged serving as foreign agents on one side or the other of this conflict. this disagreement between the various Arab states and Qatar. And it was pretty clear that only one side of that effort really took any criticism. And that's one of the problems with the FARA law, is that it's so selectively enforced. Because it's enforced so rarely, it's very selectively enforced. So either we need to be more aggressive against all foreign agents and make clear to everyone involved that we're going to enforce this law very aggressively, and so you should make sure that everything you do is above board, or we should just not enforce it. But to enforce it selectively hurts the credibility of the U.S. government, I think, even more. So it's important to make a decision on that. My preference would be to enforce it aggressively, to make sure that everybody who serves as a foreign agent registers in accordance with the law, and to do so without, without fear or favor, because we know it's going to happen. We know there's going to be foreign attempts to influence the United States. As I said earlier, it's necessary for that. But what it shouldn't be is hidden. It shouldn't be a surprise. People should know when people are being lobbied by foreign governments, and it shouldn't be done through illegal or underhanded behavior. When you start talking about, as you mentioned, the actual hacking of political opponents and the leaking of their documents, that's a serious issue, and that needs to be investigated seriously, regardless of what your views are about any of the individuals involved or what their various policies or politics were, right? That itself should be investigated very seriously. If you have a foreign government hacking US citizens in order to achieve its political objectives, that should be treated as a serious issue. And the fact that it hasn't been treated as a serious issue, that national security journalists have been, if anything, more than willing to receive these hacked information in order to write stories, I think is to their discredit.
That's actually a very disturbing development. And, while we are on the subject of this strange pattern of one-sided selective enforcement, I want to bring forward a couple of more recent cases. One with the former Trump political operative and well-known investor company owner Thomas Barrack being charged with illegal government again on behalf of UAE. At the same time, Congressman Eric Swalwell was documented traveling to Qatar on a pleasure trip, where he was observed riding camels and having a great time. And if you look at, first of all, that's not Swalwell's first encounter with foreign lobbying efforts. We've seen him fall for a Chinese honey trap. I'm not sure if there's any connection between two incidents, but clearly he's seen as an easy mark. But we've also seen his political rhetoric following his trip to Qatar, where he essentially defended Qatar geopolitical positions on various issues and criticized others. So this individual is a Democrat and is pro-Qatar. The Republican political operative Thomas Barrack was perceived to be pro-UAE and and pro-Trump. And Swalwell faced no consequences legally. At least we don't know how it will turn out for him politically down the road, but legally so far he has not faced any issues despite his fairly open collusion with the pro-Qatar lobbies, whereas Barrack is criminally charged with FARA. So how this because of various things that were happening during the summer, neither story caught a lot of attention, and actually both sides tried to downplay it a little bit due to, again, the attempt to for at least an economic reconciliation after our war. But for the U.S., from the U.S. perspective, regardless of how UAE, Qatar, and all the other participants in that agreement feel about it, that is a relevant domestic security issue. You have a congressman traveling to a foreign country and coming back with the talking points that seem to have been given to him by that country. You have another guy being charged criminally. He was not a political operative, he's a businessman. So I'm trying to figure out what is the approach by the administration, and what is it that we have seen this kind of really selective enforcement under the Trump Department of Justice, and now we're seeing the continuation under the Biden administration. Why this consistent pro Qatar um, selectivity, regardless of what president and what party is in power? Do you think? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I would say that obviously there was, even while President Trump was in power, a strong bias against the president and against his officials by elements of the administrative state, the bureaucracy inside the Department of Justice. So I think that plays a role. We saw that with the leaking of the Ukraine conversation between the President Trump and the president of Ukraine, which led to the whole impeachment debacle and all of that nonsense. And that was obviously something that was being ginned up against the president and would not have been done similarly, as we just saw, where Biden had a conversation that was leaked, and the media basically shrugged about it. But I think part of it, yes, is that Qatar is more effective in its lobbying and behavior. They very skillfully played both sides. They worked very hard to bring on certain people who were perceived as being pro-Trump and to influence the Trump administration, while also, of course, they were using Al Jazeera and other elements of their influence power to target the president very aggressively. So they were kind of playing both sides there, as Qatar frequently does. But so yes, there is the political angle. Some of it is domestic U.S. politics. Why does Eric Swalwell get away with things that a Republican would not get away with? Well, it's because he's a Democrat. He's close to Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And importantly, he's a member of the Intelligence Committee. So
that's kind of disturbing.
The fact that he has these foreign contacts that he's not disclosing, the fact that he appears to have had intimate, of some kind or another, relations with a Chinese spy and yet remains on the Intelligence Committee, it's because Nancy Pelosi has chosen to allow it, right? She could remove him if she chose to, and she chooses not to. Because she puts politics in front of national security. I think that the Qataris have done a very good job of convincing the bureaucracy in Washington that they are an ally and a friend. I think that we saw during the Arab Spring that I was mentioning, while the Obama administration was making all of these behaviors and moves in Syria and Libya that they didn't necessarily want to be on the front page of the New York Times, they worked closely with Qatar to allow them to do things they otherwise maybe didn't want to get caught doing. So I think Qatar has some leverage within the deep state, if you'll permit the term, because they do serve as a useful tool for the United States at certain times. It was the same thing with the deal with the Taliban. The U.S. could not put, the people in the U.S. that wanted to do a deal with the Taliban could not put pressure on Qatar for its other bad behavior, because they needed Qatar to host the Taliban in order to do a peace process that would get the United States out of Afghanistan. And Qatar takes advantage of being useful in these ways to get other things that they want. And of course, we now see in Afghanistan that it looks like they are absolutely going to come out on top. They may have some control or access of Kabul airport, and who knows what other benefits that they will extract from having been the mediator for this Taliban-US deal.
It's interesting though, because there seems to be a strange cross section of yes, there's the political bias of Democrats against Republicans and so on and so forth, but we're also seeing that the Republicans connected to Qatar are not being investigated for foreign lobbying, even if it's politically expedient for the Democratic administration to do so. So there seems to be both a persistent bias towards Qatar that overrides even the political partisan divide in the United States. Qatar just seems to be getting away with all these things. We are also seeing that play out effectively on a political level, where UAE had weapons deals frozen, and so did Saudi Arabia, whereas Qatar faced some level of questioning from a few kind of libertarian members of the Congress, like Rand Paul, but overall did not face nearly the same level of challenges in that regard. They make very effective purchases of airplanes and other things from the US with no problem, and in fact have a deal with the South Carolina for production of guns. But Qatar is now being investigated for funding IRGC. Why aren't they facing these types of holdups in Congress for their weapons on the basis of weapons? What is it about their lobbies that's simply so much more effective than the lobbies of all the other parties?
I think it has to do with Qatar's influence strategy, which was not about just targeting individual congressmen or just setting up think tanks. Obviously, Qatar does that. They have their close relationship with the Brookings Institute, for example, which they're able to exploit very successfully. But more importantly, Qatar invested in media, and they invested in powerful and politicized media. So they were able to do things to take advantage of missteps by the Saudis, such as the Khashoggi incident, where they were able to paint the Saudis as a bad guy. They can take advantage of sort of traditional U.S. mistrust in general for the region, and they can exploit that. And then we see that also, of course, with the pressure against Yemen. With the Saudi effort in Yemen. Some of that is because it favors what the Biden administration wants to do anyway. For example, they delisted the Houthis as a terrorist organization, and they are trying to make a deal with Iran. So they aren't really interested in having the Saudis defeat an Iranian proxy in Yemen. And then, of course, the Qatari lobbies and media is able to exploit that and make it a much larger issue in the minds of the American people than it is, and in the minds of the American representatives. So when the American representatives go in to vote, the only thing they're remembering is that story that they read about how the Saudis accidentally bombed somebody in Yemen, and they're not thinking about, they're not hearing the story about Qatar's ties to the IRGC, for example. That's not being emphasized by anyone. So it's just not on their radar. You do then, of course, have the other sort of more concerning relationships, the business relationships in the States. The Qataris were very intelligent in the way that they made certain investments. We saw them aggressively trying to get influence at the state level in, for example, South Carolina, which you mentioned. Also in Florida, they targeted a number of influential state level actors. And it's because they realize that to influence congressmen, you influence their state. And when congressmen or senators realize that to interfere with the Qataris will impact their state and their state economy and the way that their citizens in that state are doing, which will then in turn impact that senator or representative's reelection, it becomes much more potent for them. So the Qataris had a much deeper, much more intelligent influence operation, which, by the way, I mean, they're not the only ones to do that. We are seeing from the Chinese, for example, a similar activity where they are, and the Trump administration director of intelligence warned about this, that the Chinese were actively seeking influence operation at the state level, targeting governors, governors' staffs, state representatives, state business leaders, state union members, all in order to exert political influence.
I will actually am going to get back to China momentarily because China's cross-section with some of the Middle Eastern actors is relevant and disturbing, and it's part of some of the later peace deals on the other side that have not been really addressed quite as much from the lobbying point of view. They've been China's deals with Saudi Arabia and Iran has been addressed mostly from economic, energy, and a little bit from the defense perspective, but not from the impact it has on the region in terms of businesses, and certainly not the way it would affect the United States. I'll get back to that momentarily. For now, I wanted to get back to Abraham Accords and the way these foreign influence campaigns kind of played into that, or they used the Abraham Accords as an additional point of lobbying discussion. We have seen a number of countries effectively use the Abraham Accords to move their own interests, which was part of the deal. For instance, Morocco gained U.S. recognition or of its sovereignty over Western Sahara. That was a major success for them. In return, they restored relations with Israel and now are pursuing a number of bilateral deals with Israel, and increasingly also improving the economic relations with the U.S. far beyond the usual kind of defense security sphere, which was normal prior to this. On the other hand, another side used this issue to kind of intensify its lobbying efforts, which was the Algerians. Now, Algerians, unlike the Qataris, they had been extremely successful in the U.S. for many years, primarily because the Moroccan lobbies had been so ineffective, and frankly, their lobby has been largely corrupt and, basically non-existent. A lot of money floating around, but not a lot of political action. But the Algerian lobby has penetrated campuses. It has gained very high-profile spokespeople like John Bolton and others. Even Senator Inhofe is seen as a kind of pro-Algerian figure. And at the same time, they managed to stay behind the scenes and not attract too much attention. Unlike Qatar, that boasts of major think tanks on its payroll and media and this and that, we don't really know how Algeria manages to achieve its level of success. They do it behind the scenes. They are not, and they do it through alliances with other activists who are perceived to be as anti-Morocco, but are not necessarily themselves, directly involved in Algerian issues. So we are seeing them using the Abraham Accords. Recently, they terminated relations with Morocco, and it's perceived that their strong opposition to any sort of relationship with Israel was part of the reasoning for that. In the U.S., that sort of influence is concerning because Algeria is perceived as a major economic actor with a lot of oil money influence. There's a lot of people who are letting Algeria get away with a lot and giving them a lot of credit for things that are not necessarily accurate, such as the alleged fight against terrorism, which you might argue, then how come some Algerians are some of the top terrorists in ISIS and other such groups? We're seeing that this sort of underhanded influence is actually even more dangerous than Qatari influence because they can play a role in undermining Abraham Accords indirectly by bringing in people who are otherwise friendly and so forth, but who have this thing and play on the fact that most Americans know even less about North Africa than they know about the Middle East, much less. Neither Algeria or Morocco is on anyone's front pages most of the time. How do you see the role of that lobby now in terms of these things? So far, the FARA thing has not really been an issue for them, and so far we don't even really know who they are. I mean, they're not, as I said, listed in newspapers like the Qatari lobbies day after day. They just do their job and that's it.
That's all very interesting. I was not aware, to be honest with you, and you mentioned the ignorance of Americans in North Africa of the extensive role of Algeria. So that is interesting to me. It does not surprise me. I mean, if you go back to the 1970s, Algeria was constantly playing a role as a sort of perceived mediator during, the Palestinian conflict with various terror attacks in Europe and stuff, and Algeria would come in and offer to assist, and they were really getting something out of it, of course. So this is an old game in one way. I think there's an issue with the fact that the Biden administration does not support the Abraham Accords. They refuse to even say the word Abraham Accords because the Abraham Accords ultimately, I think the intent of the Trump administration was to use the Abraham Accords to check Iran in the region and to help the various forces that were opposed to Iran in the region, help them work together to oppose Iran in a world where the United States does not wish to be actively engaged in the Middle East anymore. The problem with that, where we have this structure which is being created or has been created with the Abraham Accords, where the creator of that structure, the United States, is absent, you now have a field where it can be used or exploited by other participants. Now, to a certain extent, there was an understanding, the US had to make some deals in order to get this done. So they did give in on things like Western Sahara that had been long time issues for the United States that they hadn't, were not negotiating on. And they decided, the Trump administration decided, you know what, this is important enough for us achieving this Abraham Accords that we're willing to give in on certain things, which is how negotiations work. But with the Biden administration disengaged on the whole process, not interested in expanding it, not interested in using it to any positive effect, you do have the case where other individual nations may try to exploit it for their own purposes. And I think it's important that to the extent that we can do anything about that is to remind people that the centrality of the Accords needs to be about checking the role of Iran and the relationship, building a positive relationship with Israel and peace in the region. Those are the two main elements of the Accord. And if elements of the region are trying to use the Accord for something other than those two issues, then they're using it in a way that it's not intended. And I think the other members of the Accord need to say that explicitly. This is about Iran. This is about building a stable region that's at peace with Israel. It's not about your petty concerns in this country or that country. And if they do that, I think loudly and together, it'll be a good positive.
Now, it's interesting because Morocco itself actually terminated the relations with Iran before a week before US withdrew from JCPOA. Algeria, on the other hand, has grown closer to Iran over time, both economically and militarily, which actually what contributed to the rift between Morocco and Iran to begin with. On the other hand, some of the Gulf states are either economically dependent on Iran to some capacity, or they perceive themselves to be unable to stand up to Iran militarily without U.S. involvement and presence in that role. In other words, there was a perception that while the Abraham Accords were supposed to limit U.S. presence, help limit U.S. presence, they were not. They were never meant as a complete substitute. U.S. was still supposed to be engaged and involved to some extent. And the question is, if U.S. is not willing to militarily back up this structure, then other interests come in, and they may claim to that can undermine it and make it about something other than that. Iran has been coming in individually to some of these countries and rallying them on various, trying to negotiate with them on various issues separately. And Iran has been trying to bring that discussion through its own propaganda machinery in the US. Speaking of which, the Iranian lobby has not been sanctioned at all in any capacity, and that is the most disturbing thing at all, because it there we have the closest to some element of a kind of fifth column that even outranks the quote unquote these pro-Qatar lobbies, because those at the end of the day are nothing but a financial, mercantile, completely mercenary motivated exchange. They hire lobbies who perform the tests in exchange for money and various benefits, and that's it. Iranians, on the other hand, the Iranians engaged in the propaganda on behalf of Iran. Most of them are Iranian Americans. Most of them are being used to sell a particular perspective of the Iranian American community and interests, and used to infiltrate the institutions and structure curriculum and influence education, and all of that goes much deeper than a simple exchange of financials. So my question to you is, why wasn't this issue pursued more aggressively under the Trump administration, and what can be done about it, if anything, under Biden administration?
Well, and I know we'll get to it, but when you talked about people, countries coming in to utilize the accords for their own purposes, and the role of the United States, you're talking about the Chinese coming in and trying to cut deals with the Saudis. In large part, I see that as a unforced error by the United States, because the Biden administration and the bureaucracy has been so aggressively anti-Saudi and pro-Qatari during this whole conflict. The Saudis started reasonably looking to see who else there was to talk to. The United States needs to be engaged. I think the goal is to no longer have to stand in front of our allies in the region, but to instead stand beside them and behind them, so that the U.S. is not the one making all the decisions, forcing all of the outcomes, the sole user of force or the sole responsible party, but that they are backing certain countries in the region to enforce a peaceful and stable region that the U.S. can get behind.
By the way, to challenge that a little bit, not that I disagree with that idea, but to challenge that that's what's actually was supposed to happen, let's look at the Yemen war. From Saudi perspective, it was a defensive act. They were asked by the Yemen's legitimate government to come in return, in response to an uprising by an Iran-backed group closer to Iran over time. And from Saudi perspective, it was a defensive act for themselves, because they themselves were being terrorized. So they took action with some limited US support, but they were the leaders of the Arab coalition in that effort. Now, yes, it's true that Trump refused to withdraw from Yemen when he was pushed to do so, but over time he decreased involvement there, and his position on Yemen has been minimum, and his involvement against other terrorist organizations there has also been minimal. So the question is, if the message was, well, we'll back you guys up, you need to start taking steps yourselves, where how is that possible? We see from one specific examples when Saudis came in very aggressively, had initial major successes against Houthis, and
They
then
were immediately criticized.
that's exactly right, including by the U.S., which did not back them when they had the opportunity to destroy the Houthis and claim a major military victory independent of U.S. involvement. So what's and that's true for both parties, by the way. It's true for the Republicans, which have been largely at best silent, or they focused on the sanctions against the Houthis and so forth, and they've been, of course, very critical of the Houthis, but they haven't really back the Saudi military effort. So why is that? If the philosophy is that we want Saudis and everybody else to become more independent, why aren't we backing that when they're doing exactly that?
Because the U.S. government is extremely schizophrenic.
Mm-hmm.
There is no, I mean, and we frankly saw under the last administration, there was no one policy. There was what the president was being encouraged to do by one set of supporters, and then and I think what I described was the basis of the Abraham Accords. It was the purpose of it. But when it came to other portfolios like Yemen, they were being treated like they weren't all part of the same effort. They weren't being treated like a grander strategy. And you then had the problem that the Trump administration never really successfully controlled the administrative state. They never really got a handle on how to make the US government do things that the Trump administration wanted them to do. And so you always had these situations where anytime the president and his direct group of advisors were not directly engaged in an effort, it was being undermined and things were going in a different direction. So I think that, anybody who's trying to analyze the US behavior and not understanding just how deeply riven and schizophrenic it is going to have a hard time. There's what the Trump administration and certain advisors were trying to accomplish, and then what happened whenever they turned their back. And of course, you do have, in the U.S., the simple reality that the Congress does get involved, and that's where the Qataris and the others are able to make their play. On the Iranian lobby issue, I think you have a point. I think we need to. I think it's true, and I think we need to remind people the vast majority of Iranian Americans hate the regime and hate the Iranian lobby. The Iranian lobby does get to cover themselves as if they are a domestic constituency, and they do try to do that. The major players we're thinking about are groups like the National Iranian American Council, where they try to portray themselves as a domestic constituency, but they're not. Their founder was, linked to Iranian agents and so on and so forth. So, but they are able to disguise themselves as a domestic constituency. They are then additionally benefited by the fact that it is the policy of the Biden. It was the policy of the Biden administration. It's now the Obama administration. Now the Biden administration to cozy up to Iran. And so they are being admitted into the halls of power in order to help facilitate that. I think that the Iranians learned the lesson of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Qataris, actually, the other way around, I think, because they showed having groups, ideological groups that support you, but who can portray themselves as a domestic constituency, even though the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States does not represent all of Arab Americans or all Muslim Americans, although they claim they do. Mm-hmm. But having that ability to portray yourself as a domestic constituency allows you a lot more leverage, a lot more opportunity than does simply, as you said, mercenary lobbyists who you are paying in exchange for services. So I think that's a real it's a real issue, and it's a real issue for U.S. domestic security to try to deal with. When are you looking at a genuine lobby? When are you looking at a genuine constituency? As I said, we have ethnic constituencies in the United States. They have a right to express their opinions about their home countries and so on. And when are you looking at what is in fact foreign influence being directed from the outside? So that's a real challenge, and it needs to be very carefully handled, but it needs to be acknowledged in order to be dealt with.
So now that brings me kind of back to the other issue that we were discussing, which is the collusion between different international lobby groups, potential collusion. We're already seeing China grow closer to some of the Middle Eastern states, and we already know that China has significant economic and political and even military interests in that region. Now, what happens? We're already seeing them try to cut deals with Iran, with Saudi Arabia. They've tried, unsuccessfully, but they've tried the vaccine diplomacy with UAE and Bahrain. That did not work out because the vaccine was flawed, but it was initially successful in terms of people jumping on it and them coming in early before the US and so forth. What happens if China, which already is penetrating diaspora communities in the US, decides to align itself with Qatari lobbies or with other lobbies for initially some limited joint interest on some economic issues, but later become more involved in kind of these formal political lobby groups on various angles, including to pressure certain states to basically bully certain other states that are also lobbying in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's a genuine concern. I mean, you just look at China's and we've not seen in the Middle East any real pushback on China. I think there's recognition from everyone that if the U.S. wants to get out and the Chinese want to get in, then that's going to be a reality that they're going to have to deal with. And I think they should rethink that, because dealing with the Chinese is not going to be at all like dealing with the United States. They are, not a reliable partner in economic development or in any number of things. The Chinese are very extractive. They get what they want and then they leave, or they manipulate in order to just keep getting what they want. But I've not seen any real pushback on that. I mean, you saw even the Taliban is not going to criticize China on, for example, its treatment of its Muslim population. I think that's a real issue. On the domestic front, in terms of the lobbying, I think you're right. Any of these various foreign influence campaigns are concerning and dangerous, but especially so when they act in concert and when they can create the impression of a large coalition. So we've already seen, for example, close cooperation between Qatari and Turkish lobbies in the United States. Add now also the Iranian lobby. Add now also the Chinese lobby and influence campaigns. You're talking about a very large influence effort that could, easily sway on any particular issue that was of interest to them. I think the advantage of Americans is our federal system. It's, to a certain extent, it's our disadvantage, but it's also to our advantage. It's to our disadvantage in the sense that there are any number of places where influence from foreign agents can enter the system. We talked about the Qataris in South Carolina and Florida, for example. We talked about the Chinese trying to do the same thing. But it's also to our advantage in the fact that there are a number of, we can combat foreign influence at the state legislatures. We can combat it at the federal level as well. So we can use that to our advantage. We've already seen, for example, both the state of Texas and the state of Florida have made laws targeting Chinese influence. And in the case of Texas, also, I think Iranian and a couple of others as well. having to do with that had to do with Chinese efforts to acquire critical infrastructure inside the state of Texas. But I think you're going to see more of that in the future. We've seen a pushback against Chinese Confucius Institutes on college campuses at the state level, not at the federal level, but at the state level. So I think that more can be done at the state level to combat foreign influence of all kind, which would be very positive. But yeah, as you say, the larger they can make that lobby look, the larger they can make that constituency look, the more they're able to extract from legislatures.
And that's also an intimidation tactic, because it's one thing to fight Qatar, which is a rich but relatively small state, and everybody's kind of annoyed with them, and okay, and they're known for infiltrating particular sectors of economy and focus on those areas, and everybody kind of knows and understands the style. But Qatar plus China is not something anybody really wants to fight. It's a huge machine. China is a mammoth. It has
Right. I
infiltrated
mean,
U.S. economy to such an extent that California's economy would probably collapse without Chinese inclusions right now. So what we are talking about is foreign interest essentially not only lobbying but essentially controlling aspects of the United States at this point.
I mean, I don't know if I would go quite that far yet, but it's a real risk.
Mm-hmm.
We have an administration in the Biden administration, which their susceptibility to foreign influence and underhanded financial issues is pretty clear. You have the whole Hunter Biden situation in the Ukraine and with Chinese companies, and it's pretty clear that an element of influence was in the system already, and I think it's probably only getting worse. I don't want to say that all is lost. The Chinese have a lot of influence, but that also means, and they have a lot of things inside the United States. They have a lot of assets inside the United States, but that also means that they have pressure points, and that there are things that can be denied them or taken away from them, or pressure can be put upon them. One of the things that I think is worth considering, and there's going to be a fight over in the near future, is meat processing and protein. Chinese are really hurting for access to protein, meat. They control one of the largest meat processors in the United States. They'll probably seek to control others as well in the near future. The US should consider some of these industries like meat processing as critical infrastructure and relevant to national security, and deny Chinese companies access to them because the Chinese, are trying to get an angle on, the thing that matters to all of us, which is what we eat. And there are dozens of other industries where similar behavior is taking place. There are things we need from the Chinese, but there are also things the Chinese need from us. And we can put pressure on them, but we have to do it aggressively, and we have to be willing to stand up to the lobby that they're going to create to push back when that happens. And I think legislators need to be aware of that. Governors need to be aware of that. The Biden administration, I don't have a lot of hope for influencing right now. Maybe in 2022, if there's political changes, or if Democratic lawmakers lose faith in Biden over the Afghan debacle, for example, maybe there's going to be places you can push the Biden administration on this too. But as you say, it could get really bad. And this is absolutely, ultimately, at the end of the day, the Chinese goal is to achieve its objectives through influence, not through conflict, but through manipulation, through influence, through economic pressure, until you are unable to defend yourself.
So I kind of wanted to draw attention to another issue that kind of is relegated to the back burner, but is becoming an increasingly central to other issues, which is the role of the human rights industrial complex in the lobbying issue, and now it's kind of taking starting to influence the tech sector, and there is an intersection between human rights, security issues, privacy issues, campaigns. We are talking about the strange occurrence. On the one hand, the GCC and Egypt seem to have normalized economically and politically with Qatar following the Alula agreement. On the other hand, there's still a lot of back and forth through lobbies on specifically human rights issues in the West that are turning into actual creation of political bodies in the US and very aggressive effort on that front and with no registration and so forth. And of course, the media also no far accusations of or real investigations of media taking foreign funding for publications with journalistic business model, being what it is these days. On the other hand, we're seeing that human rights is no longer relegated to particular activists, just, banging on the table about some people getting arrested over, whatever, freedom of speech or whatever in some country. No, we are seeing a collusion between human rights organizations and big tech and political and between big tech and the Democratic Party and the governing coalition. We're seeing the freedom of speech issues being affected in the US. We're seeing some of the kind of human rights activists, particularly of the Islamist variety, linking themselves to major social media giants and by extension attacking bodies that are perceived to be a threat to them, such as Israeli surveillance companies, which are frequently anti-Islamist or work with countries that are anti-Islamist and use them for surveillance of Islamist threats. We are seeing all of this taking place quite openly, some of it through the usual kind of publicity campaigns, but a lot of it also through courts and actual political resolutions and real political action and investigations. And it's really concerning because that affects average Americans in some way as much as it affects those specific companies, countries that align with them, and so forth. Because we are seeing the same strategy being utilized to silence Americans on their criticism of certain issues, and we're seeing foreign actors play a role in that, in affecting the way speech is being handled by social media giants in the US. Having foreigners advise on that is concerning. So my question to you, what do you think about the future? Where is it all going? What can be done about it? Is there any way to decouple these influences from the already problem? And let's not forget the Chinese surveillance state model and how the big tech plays into all of that. And now they're introducing the same model to Saudi Arabia specifically and also to Iran. So where do we even begin to unravel this complicated nexus of interest that ultimately is also a huge foreign influence campaign that's much more serious than the usual propaganda, which is fairly easy to discern. But now we're talking about laws, we're talking about regulations, we're talking about privacy issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's really concerning. I mean, when you talk about, for example, with what is it, Facebook, that has their advisory committee that there's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood on, who is getting to decide what you do and don't get to see about Israel or about Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Yemen or what have you, issues which probably the majority of corporate leadership at Facebook does not care about. So she can have an outside extensive influence on those sorts of things by saying this is hateful, this is not, this is acceptable, this is not, to control not just what you see but what you don't see, right? And the power of this kind of collusion between the nonprofit, the NGO industrial complex, as you called it, I think quite rightly, or human rights industrial complex, and big tech and certain players either state actors or powerful non-state actors. It's deeply concerning. I mean, I think we all saw, with the the revolution in Egypt, the revolution in Tunisia, what power could be used by some of these groups by controlling the lens of what people see through digital media to create impressions that are not necessarily realistic. To give you an example that's outside the Middle East, the situation in Colombia, where there was the appearance of massive rioting, and everyone was saying, oh, the Colombian government is cracking down and violating human rights and this, that, and the other thing. And one of my good friends who focuses on Latin America pointed out that much of the social media traffic was coming out of servers in Bangladesh. They were commenting about Colombia, but they were operating on the basis of a script that had been set for them, and then some outfit in Bangladesh had been paid to create social media posts to make it appear as though there was a public outcry. And the way that the digital technology works, people start to make snap decisions about things that they see or think they saw, and then very quickly you can gin up a human rights campaign about it, and you can start putting pressure on legislatures, and you can have real change before anybody realizes that maybe the situation is not what you thought it was. And they can, through control of the big tech, they can make sure that you don't see anything contrary to what they're trying to convince you. And so what are you to do? If you're an average person and you don't spend that much time thinking about these issues, and everything you see pushes one direction, the Khashoggi affair is a perfect example of that. Nobody was willing to say that Jamal Khashoggi was a Qatari asset, that he had very Islamist sympathies, and that maybe there was a lot more going on here than anybody wanted to admit. But instead,
let's admit it, in such situations, the intelligence of any given country has a lot more at stake in terms of getting rid of someone like him than some prince with no experience in handling assassinations. It's just
and I think, you can fairly criticize the way that it was handled, and have an issue with it, and still admit that the whole thing was manipulated.
Yeah,
that the whole
absolutely.
information
Even if you
campaign is
assume the
manipulated.
worst about the whole scenario, the fact that the amount of funding that went into creating an outrage machine for over 2 years now is remarkable. But if you start delving deeper and start looking at how it was used for various other things, including this whole surveillance issue, including targeting Israeli companies with, quite frankly, anti-Semitic undertones, you start to ask yourself, who was
it had a big impact on reining in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Right. So you had this one incident that
it had nothing to do with anything. It had nothing to do with Yemen whatsoever. Nothing.
And yet it has a powerful impact on policy. This is a very dangerous situation, very dangerous outcome. There's a couple of bills in front of Congress on big tech that I think would help, that are important. I don't know that they're going to get a fair hearing. The US Congress, in the couple of times that they've called sort of the big tech leaders in front of them, they haven't done a good job of really holding their feet to the fire, or they kind of come off as old guys who don't really know what they're talking about with big tech, with a couple of exceptions like Senator Ted Cruz, who really put the screws to some of them, which was enjoyable to watch. But some of these tech guys, Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, they clearly, the people at Google, whoever that is, they clearly believe they're bigger than governments now. And they may be right, at least in some cases. It's a very dangerous situation, and we need to start thinking about it very seriously. what the implications are for national security, what the implications are for the way that nation states interact with each other. Where in the past, we don't do certain things like fly fighter bombers over somebody's country without permission. But how do we handle the digital influence in their country? And for people that, I come from a relatively conservative organization, but from people on the other side who were, all concerned about Russian misinformation and this and that during the campaign, regardless of what you think about that, you do seem to agree that digital misinformation, digital manipulation by state actors is a real issue and needs to be addressed. So we need to start taking it seriously and thinking about how to handle it, or it's going to cause a real problem. I can see a situation where these sort of information campaigns and these sorts of digital campaigns end up invoking a military response or a covert military response, because if you don't have the information operations capabilities of your opponent, you're going to have to respond with some other kind of capability. So you may have, if you're a country with a strong army and your neighbor doesn't have a strong army, but they're beating you up through the digital space, how do you respond to that? I mean, at a certain point, you may decide that it's a weapon just like any other, and you're going to respond in kind or with some other weapon of your own choosing. I think that's where the world is going if we don't get a handle on it.
And there is another disturbing angle to all of this. With increased polarization, not just in the US, but in Europe and in general, with increased isolation, social isolation, in part due to COVID-related regulations, in part due to social media disenchantment that has caused many people to leave social media without really finding alternatives. So combination of a lack of general open social interaction, echo chambers, entrenchment of certain mentalities, you create an environment where people have a distrust in both the media and the governments, but at the same time can be isolated from each other, and so are easier to manipulate individually because they don't get to bounce off discussion points from a diverse variety of friends and colleagues. So now people don't see each other face to face as much in certain parts. There's still a concern about COVID or government or restrictions or whatever. People travel less, people interact less on social media and less openly due to either issues with the quality of interactions or concerns about being fired or whatever else. So this is the perfect time when isolated, polarized, distrustful individuals can fall through anything, ranging from conspiracy theories about whatever vaccines or the government or whatever else to being weaponized and being recruited for things they know nothing about and don't even necessarily want to be a part of. We are we're seeing an environment where it's increasingly harder to fight all of these forces. Whereas previously you saw, some trolls and you could develop tools to identify them. Now, with the digital environment is much more, it's no longer what it was even a couple of years ago. Many people left, many people are no longer as active. You don't know where people are getting their information from, really. Instead of going to Facebook and kind of, seeing what your friends say, you're not going to obscure conspiratorial websites, maybe. People don't even know where you're going to get your info. Previously, it was easier to predict because you were there with everyone else and your social, milieu. So now we're having this process. So what do you think, what tools can help us fight in this new age of digital information warfare and digital manipulation and influence campaigns, when you don't even know who you're dealing with? You don't see your opponent face to face. You don't know whether it's a foreigner, an advertising agency, a government agency,
or even if it's a real person at all,
yeah.
right? I mean, how many times do you have an interaction on something like Twitter, and you tweet something and you suddenly get all these responses, and you realize you must have said something that some algorithm picked up,
Mm-hmm.
and now all of a sudden you are being attacked, and you're like, are these people even real?
Mm-hmm.
So you create the impression that like anybody who disagrees with me is a bot. And so as you said, it isolates you. It drives you into a situation where you're distrustful. And I think in large part, I blame two things. I blame censorship,
Mm-hmm.
and because we're not having free and open conversations anymore. And so when conversations are censored, people don't get a chance to actually understand the depth of the conversation and figure out for themselves whether to give it credibility. And sometimes, increasingly, the fact that a thing is censored gives it credibility.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the second issue, which is the distrust and lack of credibility in the institutions, which is frankly deserved. So many of the government institutions, certainly in the United States, and I think elsewhere too, has earned the lack of trust that the people have in it. They don't trust the media institutions because they have been dishonest in the past. They don't trust the government institutions because they have been dishonest in the past, or incompetent, or both, usually both. And so then you have a situation where, I have my idea that I got from, as you said, the conspiracy website, and you have your idea that you got from CNN or Al Jazeera. And, how can you really even say that your idea is better than mine, that your facts are better than mine? CNN has no more credibility than some random website that I pull up online, and Al Jazeera even less. But yeah, so you have this situation where people don't know what's behind the information they're receiving. They don't know what the intent of the information that they are being given is. And so every one of us is being forced to sift through the world and the media like an intelligence analyst, where we get information and we have to say, do I trust this source? Is this source been right in the past? Is this source trying to manipulate me? If so, what is he trying to get me to do? And of course, just because somebody is manipulating you doesn't mean they're lying. They can manipulate you with facts, or certain facts, and other facts you're not getting. So everybody is being forced into this situation that, frankly, most of us are not fit to do, because it's a very challenging process, and it's a whole. It takes your whole life to just figure out what's true on a given day. Most people don't want to do that. I think we should, to a certain extent, unplug, talk to people in person, try to develop real relationships with people, on that you can establish some level of trust. Even people that you do meet online, and relationships that you build through people, have real conversations with them. Figure out what they are about when they're not at work. What are the things they do, and see if you have confidence in them as a person, and not just as a media outlet or a talking head, and I think that'll go a long way. Ultimately, we're going to have institutions that have credibility. Hopefully, people are out there right now creating those institutions. I think they're going to need to be new institutions for the most part. Some institutions may recover their credibility, but others, I think, never will. So we need to build new institutions which have credibility that people can be comfortable with and rely on, and we need to build personal relationships. Those would be my only two real positive suggestions, but it's a
Now,
challenging environment.
back in the 80s, US used to have a fairly small but relatively effective agency focused specifically on countering Soviet propaganda. Now, I don't think we have any real equivalent to it, and whatever we do, that's even the relics of the past have been infiltrated and have completely failed. But who, in your opinion, would have the credibility, bipartisan and transnational credibility to lead such an effort or a similar effort, whether on the U.S. government or on the private side at this point?
I don't think that institution exists yet. I
But
it's
how would
I think
you?
it's waiting for someone to create it.
Mhm. What kind of a person would it take, though? Because the think tank community is also highly polarized at the moment. The ex-intelligence community also, the ones who choose to engage in these sort of efforts rather than just private sector jobs, they also seem to be highly partisan individuals. So how do you create something that is really unified in its response?
And some of those, some of the worst actors are the ones who have set up organizations for combating disinformation.
Oh, so
So,
yeah, many of them are experts in creating disinformation. So it's
yeah, I mean, during the Cold War, as you mentioned, we had what was called the Active Measures Working Group.
Mhm.
And it was a mixture of government and outside of government people working together to combat the propaganda by the Soviets. And they had to be they had to be people who were experts. They had to be people who understood the environment. They understood how propaganda worked. But I mean, today, like I said, I don't think that institution exists yet. Maybe it will be created. In terms of making it nonpartisan, making it transnational, I mean, these are going to be things that are really difficult to do. As I said, I lean towards the idea of free speech,
Mhm.
of combating censorship. And I think if we make the ability to call out bad information when we see it available, or counter information, and we let people make decisions on their own, I still have some confidence that people will make good decisions. And so we just go from there. We push to end censorship, we push for free speech, and we hope for the creation of institutions that will take advantage of that free speech to do something and provide something that everybody is looking for, which is credibility and authenticity.
On that note, and just to wrap it up, counterfactual discussions and post-truth era where anything goes makes these sort of efforts really difficult. But there's something worse than having fake news and alternative facts and that sort of terminology becoming part of the norm. Uh, you know, uh, they didn't used to be such thing as fake news. You used to have disinformation, have a very clear, idea behind it, and fake news. It was kind of seems to accept the fact that there's no way of knowing what's real and what's not, and what's one person's fake news is another person's reality. But um, this is disturbing. But there's the other issue of wokified, highly emotionally charged discourse, which eliminates the necessity on reliance on any factual assertions whatsoever, even attempted assertions, even if they're not truthful or accurate, but at least they're based on some level of argumentation.
Yeah, I mean, to take an example of this, during the BLM riots over the summer, you had every shooting by a police officer of a suspect suddenly became very highly charged. And you even had the case where the black woman was shot while she was stabbing another black woman, a girl, I think. I don't know how old she was. I think it was juvenile. And it was on video. It was on video that this woman was armed with a knife and was stabbing someone while she was shot. And there were still agitators who attempted to use this video to spark more riots and more protests. So even though the video showed nothing of what they claimed, and in fact was the opposite of what they said, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered, as you said, was the emotional call, the pre-rational response. And I like to say that you cannot reason someone into something that you can't reason someone out of believing something they weren't reasoned into. And so we do have to think about how we can combat those sorts of things with emotional appeals of our own. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you want to avoid being exploitative in how you use emotion in making your appeals, but clearly, simply factual, pushing back on a factual level is not going to be sufficient. You have to have emotional engagement. You have to be able to push back on an emotional level. So much of what we call, fake news is really narrative, and narrative is storytelling. So you can only combat a story with another story. Now, we believe in truth, so we want it to be a true story. But that doesn't mean that our true story can't have or shouldn't have an emotional grab or appeal. It needs to if it's going to combat something of this kind.
So it's interesting to just finish off on what you were saying. The kind of the Islamist leftist alliance of Qataris, Russia, Chinese, and some of the leftist fellow travelers. They've grasped the art of the narrative. This was something that came naturally to them. That kind of this sort of narrative is part of the revolutionary order that's part of the way they operate inherently. That's why the Khashoggi campaign was so powerful, because it told a story that appealed to people. It was a fake story on every level, but it was a story with a very clear basis structure, villains, heroes, and so forth.
That's right.
We don't, the other side, and especially the US, leaving aside what the Saudis and Emiratis have not been able to do, the US has not been able to come up with its own narrative that could be an effective response to foreign influencers trying to engage with us. So not that we should be necessarily looking for fake stories of to elevate to the level of the Khashoggi level kind of penetration, but at the same time it doesn't seem to be fair that one side can come in and bring in these elaborate structural material that ends up being everywhere and everyone's picking up, and that's all they're talking about, whereas we don't have anything to say, and there are no heroes that exist, there are no higher goals, everything kind of sucks. Everything or everything we do is kind of worthless. Oh, US should not be in the Middle East, and the US shouldn't be here, and the US shouldn't be doing this. What should the US be? What makes America great? It's easy to say, let's make America great again. Let's not do those things. Let's not do the bad things that Obama did. Let's not repeat Biden's stupidity. But what do we do assertively? What makes us the country that we want to be? Who do we want to be? What's the story that we want to tell the rest of the world? It can't be just, oh, we don't really need to be in the Middle East, or we need to put America's interest first. That's common sense. Everybody puts their own interest first. That's what people do if they're if they're not detached from reality. But but how do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that's compelling and that puts us on the map in a way that catches interest and captures hearts and minds?
Sure, and I think that the U.S. is not going to be able to do that on a foreign level until we are able to figure that out at a domestic level.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, in this country right now, we have a conflict going on about what the nature of the country is. Is the nature of the country even good? Unfortunately, there are a lot of people, including powerful actors and academics and leaders, who answer that question in the negative. They say the America is not good. The only thing that can be useful or positive about what we do is by pushing, this, as you said, wokeification, just increasingly progressive ideology that really doesn't have a basis in the American founding and what America is about, and it's not well received overseas. I mean, we have the situation with the insanity of the U.S. embassy in Afghanistan, focusing on LGBT issues and flying the rainbow flag, at the very time when the Taliban is pushing in to take over the country. Does the average Afghan care about that? I think they would rather be safe. They would rather not be killed by the Taliban. They would rather know that the U.S. is going to be a reliable ally, not pull a fast one on them, and that they are going to be able to live their lives the way that they want to live them for the most part. So there is one side in the United States that does have a narrative. They do have a push for and a view of their view of what America's role is, and it's a negative role. They hate America and they want to make agreements with other countries that hate America, right? And on the other side, what I like to think of as the good guys side, the side that I'm on, is this story of the American founding, and the fact that the United States stands for the consent of the governed. We stand for the notion that people can make their own decisions and can govern themselves. That isn't to say that we should be forcing that on everyone. Mm-hmm. I may believe that you have the right to govern yourself, but that's for you to do. I can't do it for you. And that used to be central to America's foreign policy. In the days of John Quincy Adams, that we would certainly support countries that were awakening into a Republican or a small R Republican ideas, or of the nation state and so on and so forth. And we would certainly encourage that where it occurred, but it was not our job to make people do things they didn't want to do, because we have no. If we're true to our founding, we have no more right as Americans to make people do something they don't consent to than our government has to make us do things that as Americans we don't want to consent to. So we have to get back to that idea, and we do have to get back to the idea that America is a special nation. It's not the same. American exceptionalism is not just putting America first in terms of national interests. It's about living this belief that we have about people having the right to govern themselves and the ability to govern themselves. And I think if we do that and we reorder our structure on that and reorient ourselves towards that, it will improve our domestic tranquility. It will improve our foreign policy, and it will be a message that the U.S. can export. export is not the right word, can project, and that other people can look at the United States and say, we want to be like that, which is the way things, I think, used to be, or the way Americans wanted things to be, which is we didn't go somewhere and said, you will be like us. But people looked to the United States and said, we wish to be like them because the way they do things works. The way the citizens treat each other works better than the way our system works. So we want to be like that. But we have to get away from this notion that we can force other people to do that. And we should be, work well with countries that want to work with us, and we should be fierce enemies to those that want to harm us.
That makes sense, and it's pretty common sense, but we seem to have gotten away from common sense and into
We're pretty far from common sense.
Yeah, that just have really nothing to do with the way life actually works. But this has been really, really great conversation. We've gone from discussing some specific incidents of malfeasance and how we're dealing with them to kind of a broader look at how do we prevent this from becoming a problem? How do we create a core of our own that is sufficiently compelling to Americans that we don't need other people to come in and tell us, and bribe us with money to tell us to repeat somebody else's talking points for them and to spread those ideas, because we can use our common sense from our own values, from the values of our own society, to figure out who we want to back and who we don't want to deal with as much.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this was great, and I think there's still a lot more to be said on this topic in the future, and a lot more to discuss as well about how all these different actors are continuing their operations. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. This was the Washington outsider, Kyle Shideler. We were discussing Middle Eastern peace agreements and foreign influence campaigns in the US.